get me the top 10. Just what you think are the best 10. So he did. And Sinatra, Elvis, Ray Charles, Marvin Gaye.
Behind one of the most recognizable voices in music history stands a man who never stopped being a student. Paul McCartney, the genius who helped create the Beatles and changed popular music forever, didn't emerge from nowhere. He was carefully shaped by the sounds that came before him, studying other artists with deep respect and genuine admiration. From the explosive energy of Little Richard's vocals to the innovative songwriting of Buddy Holly, McCartney absorbed everything he could from the musicians he loved. These influences didn't just inspire him, they fundamentally changed the way he approached music and helped him become one of the greatest songwriters the world has ever known. Today, we're going to explore the bands and artists that made Paul McCartney the musician millions of people around the world have come to love. These are the voices that echoed through his childhood, the records that made him pick up a bass guitar, and the performers who showed him what was possible in rock and roll. Each of these artists left an indelible mark on McCartney's style, his approach to songwriting, and his understanding of what music could be. If you enjoy learning about music history and the connections between legendary artists, make sure to subscribe to stay updated with more content like this. The story begins with the Everly Brothers, a duo that McCartney once described as the greatest band to ever exist. Brothers Don and Phil Everly fundamentally shaped how McCartney understood harmony and songwriting. When McCartney and John Lennon first heard songs like All I Have to Do Is Dream in 1958, something clicked for them. The experience was transformative. McCartney later said that the biggest influence on him and Lennon were the Everly Brothers, and they desperately wanted to be just like them. The beautiful harmonies created by two male voices showed them something completely new and exciting. When the young songwriters started creating music together, McCartney would pretend to be Phil, while Lennon played the role of Don. They studied the way the Everly Brothers blended their voices and tried to recreate that magic in their own songs. Years later, in 1984, when the Everly Brothers reunited after breaking up, McCartney wrote a comeback song for them called On the Wings of a Nightingale. When Phil Everly passed away in 2014, McCartney wrote that he would always love him for giving him the sweetest musical memories of his life. The impact of the Everly Brothers on McCartney's career cannot be overstated. They showed him how two voices could become something greater than the sum of their parts. Next comes Chuck Berry, the man McCartney called a magician who created music that was somehow both exotic and normal at the same time. When the Beatles first heard the guitar introduction to Sweet Little 16, they instantly became fans. McCartney said Berry's stories were more like poems than simple lyrics, especially in songs like Johnny Be Good and Maybelline. Berry's ability to tell vivid stories through rock and roll music opened up a whole new world for the young musicians from Liverpool. Chuck Berry taught the Beatles so many things that led them into what McCartney described as a dream world of rock and roll music. The band covered multiple Berry songs during their career, including Rock and Roll Music, Sweet Little 16, and Johnny Be Good. During their early years, McCartney even borrowed the bass line from Berry's I'm Talkin' About You for the Beatles classic I Saw Her Standing There. He played exactly the same notes and said it fit perfectly with what they were trying to create. McCartney had the opportunity to meet Berry in his hometown of St. Louis when he played there on tour, and he called it a memory he would cherish forever. Berry was one of the rock and roll's greatest legends, and McCartney admitted it was impossible to sum up what he meant to all the young guys growing up in Liverpool during that era. Fats Domino represents another crucial influence on McCartney's musical development. The New Orleans piano legend thrilled McCartney and the Beatles during their early Liverpool days with songs like Ain't That a Shame, Blueberry Hill, and I'm in Love Again. These tracks introduced them to the distinctive sounds of New Orleans rock and roll. McCartney said Domino's voice, piano playing, and overall musical style was a huge influence on the Beatles' sound. The band was excited to meet Domino in his hometown of New Orleans in 1964, and McCartney remembered that Domino was wearing a huge star-spangled diamond watch, which was their first encounter with what we now call bling. Domino's appearance in the film The Girl Can't Help It was truly magnificent to them. McCartney was so deeply influenced by Domino that when he sat down to write Lady Madonna in 1968, he started singing a Fats Domino impression. The boogie-woogie piano style took his voice to a very different place than usual. Domino later covered the song himself, making it his last charting single and completing a beautiful circle of musical respect between the two artists. This kind of reciprocal admiration shows how deeply McCartney valued the artists who came before him. Smokey Robinson holds a special place in McCartney's pantheon of influences. The Motown legend was someone McCartney once said was like a deity in the Beatles' eyes. This is one of the highest compliments McCartney ever gave another artist, and it speaks to the profound impact Robinson had on their music. Robinson's smooth vocals and brilliant songwriting from The Miracles deeply touched all four Beatles members. The band showed their love by covering Robinson's song You Really Got a Hold on Me for their album With the Beatles. John Lennon wrote Not a Second Time, trying to sound like Smokey Robinson, while George Harrison later released a solo song called Pure Smokey as his tribute to the singer. Robinson met the Beatles before they became famous when they were playing in a Liverpool club. He was flattered that John Lennon knew so much about his music and was already asking him detailed questions about Miracles songs. Robinson said he loved that the Beatles were the first really popular white band who came right out and said they grew up influenced by black music and Motown. The feeling of respect between them was mutual and created a lasting friendship that went beyond just musical admiration. Carl Perkins, the king of rockabilly who wrote the classic Blue Suede Shoes, represents another foundational influence. McCartney once made a powerful statement about Perkins, saying that there were no Carl Perkins, there would be no Beatles. This shows just how important this Tennessee musician was to the band's development and identity. The Beatles covered several Perkins songs in their early years, including Matchbox, Honey Don't, and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. McCartney used to perform Lend Me Your Comb during the early Beatles days.
When the Beatles toured Britain with Chuck Berry in 1964, they spent the last night of the tour sitting on the floor with Perkins, sharing stories, playing guitar, and singing songs together. McCartney said Carl was still the guy who wrote Blue Suede Shoes and could never do any wrong in his eyes. In 1981, McCartney invited Perkins to record the song Get It for his album Tug of War. Years later, in 1993, Perkins showed up at McCartney's backstage door after a concert in Memphis with his guitar in hand. The two spent an hour playing all the rockabilly songs they both loved. The relationship between McCartney and Perkins demonstrates how these influences remained important throughout McCartney's entire career. Roy Orbison, the man with the powerful voice and dark sunglasses, became one of the Beatles' greatest idols. When Brian Epstein first asked Orbison to tour England with the Beatles in 1963, Orbison responded by asking what a Beatle was. He had no idea how popular they were becoming. The tour created a friendly competition between the two acts that pushed everyone to create better music. McCartney remembered how Orbison would sit at the back of the tour bus writing songs like Pretty Woman, and it would make the Beatles jealous. McCartney said they would tell him the song was great, but they would be thinking they needed to have something just as good. This healthy competition inspired McCartney to write classics like All My Loving on that same tour bus. John Lennon originally wrote Please Please Me as a slow, dreary song that sounded like Roy Orbison, but producer George Martin made them skeet it up, and it became their first real hit. McCartney later called their time touring with Orbison a historic moment. The Beatles were actually scared to perform after him because he was so powerful on stage, standing completely still like marble while hitting incredible high notes. Orbison showed them what true stage presence looked like. The Beach Boys, specifically the genius of Brian Wilson, had an enormous impact on the Beatles through the album Pet Sounds. When McCartney first heard Pet Sounds in 1966, he thought it was the album of all time and wondered what on earth the Beatles were going to do next. He said the album absolutely blew him out of the water. McCartney was so impressed that he bought copies of Pet Sounds for each of his children for their education in life. He believed nobody was truly educated musically until they heard that album. The bass lines on Pet Sounds particularly inspired McCartney to write more melodic bass parts for the Beatles, changing the way he approached his instrument. McCartney called God Only Knows the greatest song ever written and his favorite Beach Boys song.
It inspired him to write Here, There, and Everywhere, using Beach Boys-style harmonies in the introduction. The friendly rivalry between the two bands pushed both to greatness. The Beatles' Rubber Soul inspired Pet Sounds, which then inspired Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. When McCartney performed God Only Knows with Brian Wilson years later, he broke down crying during soundcheck because the song was so emotional. He loved Wilson and felt privileged to be around his bright, shining light. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, changed everything for young Paul McCartney. When McCartney first heard Heartbreak Hotel in 1956, he had to go to a record shop in Liverpool and listen to it through headphones in a booth. It was a magical moment, the beginning of an era for him. McCartney said Elvis was so exciting, and they were all completely in love with him. McCartney started to see pictures of Elvis, and that pulled him away from his academic path at school. He said the tingles started going up and down his spine, and the academic things were forgotten. McCartney admitted he doubted very much if the Beatles would have happened if it was not for Elvis. The Beatles finally met Elvis at his home in Los Angeles in 1965. McCartney remembered that Elvis was interested in bass guitar, which gave them a great conversation piece. Elvis was talkative, friendly, and a little bit shy, not quite what they expected. Years later, in 2013, McCartney visited Graceland for the first time and placed a guitar pick on Elvis's grave so he could play in heaven. McCartney even bought the original bass that Elvis's bassist Bill Black used on Heartbreak Hotel. This shows how deeply Elvis remained important to McCartney throughout his entire life. James Brown, the godfather of soul, was someone McCartney called absolutely fantastic. In a 2003 interview, McCartney admitted that if you stacked the Beatles up against James Brown, record for record, Brown was definitely more powerful because he was James Brown. He respected his incredible talent, even while defending the Beatles' own legacy. Brown's influence on McCartney's bass playing was enormous. McCartney absorbed elements from Brown's songs like Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, which helped him develop more spontaneous and melodic bass lines. The American soul music coming from artists like Brown fascinated McCartney and the Beatles throughout the mid-1960s. McCartney even used Brown as inspiration while recording. When working on songs in the studio, he would sometimes think to himself that he would sing it like James Brown might. He had little mental images of Brown during recording sessions. McCartney said there was something about Brown's showmanship and soul that was impossible to match. While the Beatles did different things than Brown, McCartney never stopped admiring the pure power and energy that Brown brought to every performance. He represented everything great about soul music.
Finally, at the very top of the list stands Little Richard, the screaming pioneer of rock and roll who taught McCartney everything he knows. When Little Richard came bursting into McCartney's life as a teenager with songs like Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, and Good Golly Miss Molly, everything changed. McCartney said he owed a lot of what he does to Little Richard and his style, and Little Richard knew it. Little Richard would proudly say he taught Paul everything he knows, and McCartney admitted Richard was absolutely right. In the early days of the Beatles, they played with Richard in Hamburg and got to know him personally. Richard would let them hang out in his dressing room, and they witnessed his pre-show rituals. McCartney watched him put his head under a towel over steaming hot water, then suddenly lift his head to the mirror and declare he couldn't help it because he was so beautiful. And in McCartney's eyes, he truly was. Little Richard taught McCartney his distinctive vocalizations and showed him how to scream with power and emotion. McCartney even adopted Richard's pre-show ritual of steaming his face before performances. When Richard died in 2020, McCartney thanked him for all he taught and the kindness he showed by letting him be his friend. These 10 artists and bands shaped Paul McCartney into the legend we know today. From Little Richard's explosive screams to the Beach Boys' sophisticated harmonies, from Chuck Berry's poetic storytelling to Elvis Presley's revolutionary presence, each of these musicians gave McCartney pieces of the puzzle that would become his own unique style. They showed him that music could be powerful, emotional, sophisticated, and fun all at once. They taught him about harmony, rhythm, showmanship, and soul. Most importantly, they showed him that it was possible to create something new while honoring what came before. What makes McCartney's relationship with these influences so special is his genuine humility and gratitude.
He never pretended to have invented everything himself. He always acknowledged the giants whose shoulders he stood on, and he maintained friendships and connections with many of these artists throughout his life. This respect for musical heritage is part of what made the Beatles so special. They weren't trying to erase the past, but to build on it and take it somewhere new. The story of Paul McCartney's influences reminds us that no artist creates in a vacuum. Every great musician is part of a long chain of inspiration, learning from those who came before and hopefully inspiring those who come after. McCartney absorbed the best of what these artists had to offer and combined it with his own talent and creativity to create something entirely his own. That's the true mark of genius, not rejecting influence, but transforming it into something new and wonderful.